here with one of my favorite thought leaders in the nutrition and health and transformation space, Sayer G. Welcome, Sayer G.
So good to be here, Mark. I love your interviews and what you're doing, and it's always a great pleasure to be in your, events.
Thanks. Feeling is so mutual. Let me just say a quick few words about you for anyone who's not familiar with your work. So Sayer G is a widely recognized researcher, author, and presenter, a member of the Global GMO-Free Coalition, an advisory board member of the National Health Federation, and fearless parent. He's a reviewer and editor of the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, and the founder of one of my favorite online resources and one of the world's most widely referenced evidence-based natural health resources of his kind, and that's Greenmedinfo.com. Now, Sayer G founded Greenmedinfo.com in 2008 to provide the world an open access evidence-based resource supporting natural and integrative modalities. And, that's how I first found you. I was just, doing what guys like us do. We poke around online and we find stuff.
Yes.
And somehow I found GreenMedInfo and my jaw just dropped. And then I spent a little time stalking you and finding out more about you. And like, wow, I got to meet this person. So I'm a huge fan of your work, and we've gotten to have some great conversations. And I'm wondering if we could just start out a little bit, the big picture of just how you personally got on your journey into the work that you do. How did you end up here?
Well, it's a very similar story. And we had spoken about how you also had come to this movement because of health issues. And I think both of us suffered early on from, types of illnesses that made it necessary to be within the conventional medical system. I know I had an inhaler, until I was like 20, always by my side, because I would periodically have severe bronchial asthma episodes and have to go to the hospital and undergo what felt like experimental procedures to open up my lungs. And it wasn't until I got into nutrition, diet, learning about cow's milk affecting asthma incidents, and then weed and all the other things we all know about now, that I was liberated from that system. And over time, it just became really a passion for me to identify what today, people want evidence. They want peer-reviewed, published research, because if they don't have that, well, then according to the powers that be, it's just not true. And when you have self-healing experiences and you see the wonder of something as simple as turmeric or echinacea or vitamin C, you just want to tell the world. And that's when, through happenstance, I was exposed to the National Library of Medicine's database, which is 23 million citations presently. You can go on pubmed.gov and search, and it's this huge ocean of data that you just jump into, you're swimming looking for clinical pearls, or you just sit there on the edge and fish with your keywords, and you can find the most amazing research supporting what you and I, love to advocate for, natural healing.
Mm-hmm. So these days, you and I were talking before this conversation, there's so much opportunity available to us. It just feels like there's an explosion of, in a sense, personal empowerment, because we now have access to information like never before, and we have access to kind of dig into that information. And I'm just wondering, when you kind of take a temperature of, the people in your world, the people who come to GreenMedInfo, what is the general sense when it comes to people's relationship with health information, with, integrative modalities? Like, what are you seeing from the big picture?
I agree with you. It's like this massive wave of enthusiasm when it comes to the technology like we're using now. It's amazing to think that there are thousands of people around the world that are now able to stream into this conversation, and we're able to make available, what we want to share to them. And that technology has really created, sort of the literal manifestation of the global brain, so that we're all connected, we all can share what we feel is valuable. And it's just created such a empowering movement, because previous to this, we were kind of dependent on, the priests of the body, the physicians or the scholars who state, that they know the truth, but it was very hard to get to it. In fact, just 20 years ago, you couldn't even get to the National Library of Medicine's database without, modem speeds that were, I think, 1,000 times slower. And it was, I think back then, $100 an hour. And now you can go on Greenmedinfo and you can, get tens of thousands of studies, or go on Medline, get millions. And it's such a Copernican revolution. But on the other hand, people are overwhelmed and the information is too voluminous so that they're kind of paralyzed. And so what you and I think try to do as well is to try to translate some of that and make it more understandable as best as we can, so that people can have, chunks of, edible wisdom that aren't going to give them indigestion.
Mm-hmm. Well put. Let me ask you this question. What do you notice when it comes to just the health in general of the population since you've been doing this work? Would you say, wow, the collective we seem to be getting healthier, or maybe we're kind of staying the same, or maybe things are getting worse? I look at statistics, I look at my friends, I'm trying to gauge these things. I'm just wondering, what's your big picture assessment of sort of health of the world, health of humans?
Wow. Well, it appears that I believe there's been no time that I can think of in recorded history, and we can assume even pre-recorded history, that things have been so polarized. That we have little pockets where you can get some of the highest quality food that probably has ever been produced, using technologies like biodynamic farming, using sea salt derived, hydroponics, so that it's really clean and then high mineral. And yet we also live in a time when it's a miracle any of us are standing, because we're in the post-industrial chemical apocalypse, where there's hundreds of thousands of chemicals that have had no regulatory oversight, that the industries have released directly into our food supply, our cosmetics, our air, our water, and now they're in our bodies, lodged there. And there's no toxicology research has ever assessed the combinatorial effects, the synergy of more than one of these compounds at any single time. So when you look at what are called toxicants, or synthetic, often petrochemical derived substances, additives, pesticides, and then of course almost every pharmaceutical on the planet that has FDA approval, the kiss of death technically, is a petrochemical derivative. And so we're all being poisoned. It's a miracle that we all are still standing and feeling okay, and which speaks to the resilience that I think later hopefully we can expand on, just the amazing ability of our body to heal itself and overcome what, in really scientific terms shouldn't really be possible. So yeah, it's really a tough time. I think there's cognitive dissonance where have all this great stuff available, you have so many choices, but then on the other hand, we don't. Our choices to be exposed to chemicals have been taken away from us. We can't even tell if there's GMO, Roundup laden ingredients in our foods because it's not mandatory to label them. So, it's a tough time, I think, for everyone.
Mm-hmm. I love how you mapped it out as a time of, tremendous polarization. It's so true. I got in the shower this morning, and recently I bought this natural shampoo that was made by, essentially two young hippies. And it's truly all natural, all organic, handmade. It's the best shampoo I've ever used. I felt great. And I think of, just a week ago, I was in a hotel somewhere and I forgot to bring my shampoo, and I'm using whatever's sitting in the hotel room. And I remember putting this stuff on my hair and thinking, I'm going to die, because I've so trained my body to enjoy what's natural or real or organic, that when something different shows up, I really react.
Oh, so true. In fact, that's the problem for those who are educated out there on these topics, is that once you realize, for example, just a year ago, a study was published on the effect that Roundup has in infinitesimal concentrations. We're talking about the parts per trillion range, and then recently I had a discussion with Jeffrey Smith about the paper, and he believes that it implies their parts per quadrillion range has an estrogen-like effect on breast cells so that it causes cancer, like a proliferative effect on these cell lines. It's just amazing to think that that's possible. So now when you live in a world where you think, oh my gosh, okay, it's not the dose makes the poison, but any amount of this substance, in fact, even diluting it, can have a greater endocrine disruptive or cancerous effect. It just makes you kind of go batty because previously you didn't know about it. You weren't freaking out. All the stress hormones weren't there. You were just kind of ignorantly blissful. So there is a really difficult situation for all of us here now that we didn't even have a decade ago. Now that we're aware, it can get scary, and we have to know what to do with that information. And that's where I think, I know you do this a lot. I try really hard, is to find that research that also shows that even though things are so bad, there's hope. And that there's an amazing resilience that we can access to overcome even what seems like a very bleak, situation.
It feels like, the one of the things that you and I both do is we're educators, and there's parts of that job that are so, to me, thrilling. Because I've been in a classroom since I was sitting in kindergarten. And I love learning. And in the health field, getting back to this polarization thing, there's a topic that I would love to talk about with you, just because I know you've really taken this on, and it's the topic of vaccinations. And let me just preface my question by saying, for me personally, this is a topic that's very near and dear to me, because in my infancy, I almost died a handful of times, and my immune system collapsed, and my lungs, I became intensely asthmatic within minutes after I was vaccinated. So I really spent the first 13 years of my life struggling, going from hospital to hospital and doctor to doctor. And there's so much information now coming out about the problematic nature of vaccines, which previously vaccines are kind of like motherhood. You don't question it. You don't question the value of a mother. How dare you? So I'm just wondering if you can just, give us some big picture pieces of what you've noticed as you've started to explore this topic and see what other experts are saying. Like, what's sort of going on behind the scenes here?
Well, it's a great question because, I'm a curious individual, and of course my whole platform is based on really looking at the research as a standard for, asking questions like, okay, I'm not just going to say echinacea is good for a cold. I've experienced it, I've talked to hundreds who have, but unless the powers that be have evidence to prove it, it's really not going to have any meaning, and doctors aren't going to feel compelled to use it. So for echinacea, I spent about a week looking at every published study ever on echinacea, and I indexed all the relevant studies for Greenmedinfo showing value. We have now 70 studies on its benefits. So I did the same with vaccines, and I wanted to see what the research was like. Okay, the studies that show benefit, I wanted to look at the affiliations. Is this a study funded by a drug company or a vaccine company? Is this a study funded by the government, or is it independent? And after looking at a lot of studies, I was shocked to find that the evidence to support the health policy that, the CDC's the vaccine schedule, for example, isn't really compelling. It was actually quite a shock to find this, and it was extremely meaningful to me because I have two small children. I have two daughters, and when I'm being told that for their safety and the safety of society, they should receive 60 plus vaccines by age 6, it's a really serious problem because, of course, so many of their peers are sick. We have the highest infant mortality rate in the developed world, and we have the highest number of vaccines. And this has been studied in depth. In fact, Sage published a study showing that the multiple vaccines are likely causing this, then it really brings up red flags. So, again, the research is very shockingly not pro-vaccine. And so that's really where my journey started, with questioning, whether there's really any sanity to the whole process of vaccination, which is unfortunately mistakenly equated with immunization. So this is what I really dislike when I hear this. You know, someone will ask, have you immunized your children? The problem is vaccination is not equivalent to bona fide immunity. They're already assuming that all the questions have been answered, effectiveness is proven, and that's not what they do. They use surrogate markers often now, which means they inject something into a patient, they see the antibody levels rise, and they equate an elevated antibody titer with real-world effectiveness or protection from a pathogen. And that is absolutely not evidence-based medicine. It's really a way to fast-track approval and also evade the problem, which is real-world effectiveness is almost impossible to prove. And the reason is you can never prove that any single vaccine prevented any single disease because the outcome is a non-event. So in other words, if you're intervening and you're choosing to vaccinate, you can't prove that the person didn't get chickenpox because of the vaccine, because guess what? They have an immune system. So how can you say the immune system didn't do it? It's impossible to prove. So when you look at the assumption that this is evidence-based, the notion that vaccines confer immunity, it's based on very broad epidemiological studies, which are extremely weak in terms of evidence quality.
So what happens from here is that what I've noticed in the conversation going on around vaccinations, there's this big sort of black hole around vaccinations and autism. There's even a connection that you were mentioning before, you know, potentially with GMOs. So what are some of the pieces that you have seen come together in terms of, you know, what might be some of the unwanted effects of vaccinations that we should be aware of?
Well, number one is when you look at the PDF inserts for the vaccines, this is really all the manufacturers are beholden to the public to provide. And you'll find listed clearly the ingredients, which are so shocking to see that, yes, they took thimerosal, a type of mercury, out of vaccines around, I think it was 2005 is when they started to kind of pull it out in acknowledgement that everyone was raising red flags. How can you inject mercury into any healthy individual when, you know, if you're playing with a mercury thermometer, your mom says, you know, you can't do that, it'll stay in your body forever. We know that pregnant women shouldn't eat types of fish because it can cause all types of serious harm to the fetus, but they inject it directly into children. So what they did is they switched it out for aluminum hydroxide, and it's also extremely neurotoxic. It doesn't belong in the body, it serves no biological role whatever that we know of. And so what we saw is that the rates of autism continue to expand to the point where it's truly an exponential increase. And the problem, of course, is that there are those out there who claim it's a genetic epidemic or there's some type of environmental set of causes that we haven't yet identified, but has nothing to do with vaccines. But by definition, a genetic epidemic is an oxymoron. I mean, there's no such thing. You can't genetically, in theory, it takes thousands and thousands of years for, you know, a change in the DNA sequence to confer some type of radical change in disease risk. So it's pretty ridiculous. So when it comes down to the sort of emperor not wearing any clothes, the problem is that if the CDC were to acknowledge that the brain damage caused by vaccines is linked to this dramatic increase in autism spectrum disorder cases, then the whole process of protecting the manufacturer from lawsuit, and of course the government's role in hiding data which showed the connection between certain vaccines and autism, would be exposed, and really the whole credibility of the conventional medical establishment would implode. It's a big deal because globally the CDC is still considered by many nations to be sort of the ultimate authority. And what they do is, it's called science by proclamation or eminence-based medicine, is that when you go to the CDC site and they talk about a particular topic, like say measles being deadly, you know, 1 in 1,000 people with measles die, or some kind of ridiculous distortion of the truth, they don't reference research. And what you see in the mainstream media, thousands of articles on the dangers of measles, is they reference the CDC as their authority. But in this chain, you don't see reference to actual proof which is the assumption is that somehow the CDC is on top of the evidence chain of command and that they are talking from a perspective of science. It's actually quite the opposite.
So we have such it feels like a powerful opportunity because we have to educate ourselves and we really have to kind of dive into the information and, at least listen to those who are diving into the research and go, what's happening here? It feels like it gets back to personal empowerment. I remember when I was a kid and I used to learn in grade school about all the information that was coming out from the FDA on the food pyramid, and I should be drinking a lot of milk and eating a lot of breakfast cereal and eating Pop-Tarts. So that was the reigning nutritional, and margarine for goodness sakes. And that was the reigning nutritional wisdom of the day that was, sort of governmentally approved.
Yes. I mean, one thing is so clear factually, which is that in 1986, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund was launched, which sounds great. If you're injured by a vaccine, which of course many people in the mainstream media say doesn't ever happen, then you get compensated. But what actually it did was it indemnified manufacturers from liability for manufacturing a product that can cause harm or death in the exposed populations. And so it also kept it from being possible to sue a physician or pediatrician, for example, who is just without any thought to bioindividuality or any type of susceptibility that their patients may have to injury, being sued or being liable for pushing the agenda. And so since the beginning of this program, $3 billion has been paid out to those in this country who have been injured by vaccines as settlements. And so anyone who claims that there isn't a massive burden of injury caused by vaccines can look to the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund and know that that isn't true. Furthermore, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, VAERS, only captures approximately 1% of the injuries that occur because it's a passive reporting system. And there's so much negative pressure keeping these reports from being heard because, of course, if you're a pediatrician, you have thousands of patients, you're administering all these vaccines, and your children are getting harmed, they're getting brain damage. No one in that position is going to acknowledge that the vaccine caused harm because they're saying they're safe and effective to the parents. In fact, they're saying, if you don't take this, you're going to harm someone else. You can't go to school. I mean, it's just such a really terrible system. But the facts speak for themselves. Over $3 billion in compensation has been paid out by our government for vaccine injury. So it's really disturbing that the so-called skeptics, right? They'll question a mother's observation that after early vaccine, their child went through a sudden regressive state, but they won't question the public facts, which are that the manufacturers have no liability, just like nuclear power industry. The government underwrites the risk for private industry. That is the worst type of collusion that is possible when you're dealing with the health and well-being of little children.
So how can people empower themselves in this area and learn more? Do you have any resources that you recommend for the inquisitive mind that wants to go, this is interesting. Where do I go?
Well, the first thing is common sense, because when you think about things like, for example, oh, wait, they want me to vaccinate my children with 60 vaccines so their kids don't get infected. Well, wait a second. They're fully immunized. How come they're not super immune then, right? So there's a tacit acknowledgement by those rabid pro-vaxxers that, oh my gosh, if your kids don't vaccinate, my kids are in danger. Well, if that were true, then why are you giving your kids vaccines? They're supposed to work. So number one, common sense. Number two, in this category is that the whole justification for vaccination is based on the fact that when challenged in nature to wild-type exposure, chickenpox, measles, our body meets the challenge and then has lasting immunity. In fact, it's conferred for a lifetime, whereas the vaccine schedule is peppered through with these boosters because the vaccines fail to confer any kind of significant immunity. In fact, they often result, like chickenpox results in a worse form of herpes zoster, or varicella, which is shingles, is that they just make the disease worse. And so the idea that vaccines now are required for us to be immune, when for literally millions of years, that's all we had was an immune system. It's just, if we apply common sense, we won't fall prey to the propaganda that immunization, vaccination is truly the life-saving, it's the sacred cow of conventional medicine. It's their holy grail. It's their holy water. It doesn't work. When you look at the actual implementation of mass immunization in the United States, you'll find the decline occurred after sanitation, refrigeration, improved nutrition, better hygiene protocols, less crowding. All of those factors were dramatically reduced at the time that the decline of the diseases that we now have the vaccines for, like measles and chickenpox and rubella. It was after there was already success through changing the terrain and not trying to eliminate germs, which actually help us to regulate immunity and confer lasting immunity. So that's, and then number two, because your question was the research is so abundantly clear. We released a PDF document of 1,000 studies. You can download it for free on greenmedinfo.com, showing over 200 serious adverse health effects linked to the CDC's vaccination schedule that really no one in the mainstream media is discussing. This goes from autism spectrum disorder to diabetes type 1 to psychiatric issues to bowel problems. I mean, it's really quite disturbing. And the problem is that without informed consent, without a parent knowing that these risks are there, then this is not abiding by the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. And that is a serious humanitarian issue. Not only is it unconstitutional, it is illegal, it's unethical, it's all the things that we don't want to believe that our government would force upon us, but the truth is so clear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the download from your website of free 1,000 studies, PDF, showing the not so pleasant effects of vaccinations. I mean, it's, congratulations on creating that labor of love. I know that was a lot of work.
Thank you. It's just was done for, my own process of learning that really the research doesn't unequivocally support the safety and effectiveness of vaccines. And if that's true, then there's nothing to stand on, because you can't use eminence or authority-based medicine in this day and age and assume that you're going to have credibility in the eyes of those who have sick children because of these sorts of pharmaceutical products being shoved down their throats. One size fit all is what they're doing. It's just completely unreasonable.
Yeah. This conversation reminds me once again, it feels like the zeitgeist. It feels like this is the times that we're living in right now. I mean, just think of straight up nutrition. So many of us have to find good food. So if you're born into this world, there's a very good chance that you're born into sort of an unnatural, toxic way of eating. That's the probability. You're going to be exposed to mass-produced food, nutrient-depleted food, food that's laden with chemicals, pesticides, GMOs. You don't have to do anything. That food will come your way. If you travel across the United States in a car, there are stretches for hundreds and hundreds of miles on the highway where all you can do is stop in a gas station and there's nothing real or nothing fresh. So all I'm trying to say here is that I think we live in a time when we can't take for granted that we have to go find the good. We have to find the good food. You have to go find the good health practitioner. You have to go, find the good people, the people that are your friends that will care about you. We got to look for it. It doesn't just come flooding in. And oftentimes it seems like we have to wade through a lot of disinformation to find the treasure. And it just feels like that's the times that we live in.
Totally, yeah. The default trajectory for all of us is disease and suffering, unfortunately, and packaged in a way that it seems as if it's the opposite. You know, you look at something that says all natural, well, it's guaranteed to be synthetic. You know, it's just everything is Orwellian, and in a way, like you're saying, it's forcing us to become conscious and aware in our daily decisions. It's forcing us to become more spiritual in that sense, because ultimately, choice is the most powerful thing that we are bestowed in this life, because we can make a choice to, you know, go ahead and get good food, or decide that we're going to investigate vaccination instead of letting our children just be pulled into the system. And there are many like-minded individuals doing this. In fact, the beauty of this summit or conference is that a lot of you listening are pre-selected. You're like me and Mark, and you've already kind of come to this conclusion. So together, it's like a new mycelium, or, you know, the sort of undercurrent in the soil of people that are working together to create a better world. So yeah, it's a very interesting situation. It's not easy to be healthy, but it makes you very aware, and it gives you an opportunity to be very conscious if you are going to make this your lifestyle.
You know, here we were moments ago, we were talking about vaccinations, and, you know, how it's called immunization. You know, have you been immunized? And, you know, I oftentimes think of the immune system, that we don't always give it the sort of beautiful definition that it deserves. You know, just you and I being able to sort of reach out and look at concepts or information that might not be healthy, that might be toxic, that's sort of like the psychic immune system at work. You know, us getting together and having a conversation and sharing it with other people, that's a collective immune response saying, wait a second, there's information coming into the system, and we want to alchemize that a little bit, or we want to stop that, or we want to do something with that. You know, there's all different ways that I think immunity has to exist. And I think maybe immunity in the realm of mind might be as important as anything. It's kind of where it starts in a lot of ways.
I love that, absolutely, because, you know, you look at notions like herd immunity, which really are not based on any type of evidence. It's just this assumption that you reach a certain point in the herd where a certain number are infected, and then therefore they end up being immune. When you apply that to humans and vaccines, it's really more of just a metaphor that has been taken in a very literal sense. But, you know, the herd concept is true, is that when I post information to Facebook, for example, on questioning vaccines, and I'm referencing Lancet or some high-impact journal, it's amazing how few people will actually look at the research that they claim is so important, the science, and they'll constantly question and say, this isn't true, the CDC says it's not true. It's remarkable. We need to cultivate an immune system for the misinformation, because it is truly like a disease. I like the term meme, because a meme is an idea that has viral components. It's like ideology, you know, it takes over and in fact consumes biological resources. Is the notion is that, you know, if you're, for example, looking at life in terms of the biological instinct to reproduce, there are religions where, for example, being a martyr or not reproducing is fundamental. And so we have to start understanding that ideas have more power than genes on some level, and they are infectious. And we need to start, like you said, exerting greater immunity against false and dangerous information. And when it comes to medical information today, I think we have the ultimate religion. It's the science that devours all other religions, or the religion that devours all other religions. It's this notion that somehow science is going to give us the answer and the only way, and then when we apply it politically, you don't even have a choice. It's like the ultimate fascism.
And usually I think when people hear the term science, we often think it's a bunch of guys in white coats with gray beards nodding their heads and agreeing with each other, and sort of somehow connected to this higher, you know, irrefutable wisdom. And science, it's the Wild West, really.
It is. It's so the Wild West. It's a projection. The whole notion that you can separate subjectivity was destroyed with quantum mechanics. We know that just based on how you're looking at something, it's going to change its manifestation. If you're looking for a particle in light, it's a particle. If you're looking for a wave, it's a wave. Completely different substances. So no one can sustain the concept anymore that there's just this impartial observer and there are these little atoms or little mathematical entities that we're going to determine this is true for everyone. That's really not how it works. It doesn't mean that the other is true and it's pure subjectivity. But yes, science is an investigative, open attitude. It's about being aware of what you're perceiving. It's about really being a reasonable, using common sense individual. It's not some kind of like high level Greek, Latin, reading tea leaf type of occupation. It's really misunderstood.
So along this concept of, memes and how they're so powerful and how they can take over, there's a lot of good memes out there. And, I know you like to keep your eye on how, food is information and how even plants are imparting energies and information that we're not always aware of. I'd love to spend a little bit of time on that topic just because I find it so fascinating, some of the different ways to look at food, not just as merely, a package of nutrients, but energy and information.
I love it. I mean, because we started out really appreciating the healing properties of other entities within our environs. So if a plant was able to heal us, it had a soul and energy, and it had compassion. It was able to give us its essence, and we're consuming it. It's not living anymore. It's just sacrificial, mutually. It's like a spiritual relationship. It sounds all like poetry and sort of, a bunch of gobbledygook, but now the science is confirming this, in my opinion, because after spending so many years looking at the research on turmeric, there's 7,200 studies published right now on it on Medline, is I started to index piece by piece the studies showing benefit and found over 600 different health benefits that this one plant seemed to impart to mammals, because some of the research is on rodents, etc. And I was like, is that possible? I mean, you think about a drug, it has one benefit they market, which is actually a side effect, and then 75 plus adverse effects, which usually include death depending on the dose. And then you see something like a plant that can heal 600 different conditions, and then I analyzed the physiological actions by which it was doing these miraculous things, and it was just amazing. Over 170 different ways documented that it's able to modulate a certain pathway in the body. And so over time, it came to me, and this was based really on one study published in the Journal of Nutrition and Cancer, where they took the retinoblastoma cells, a type of neurological cancer that's extremely hard to treat, and they added curcumin to that environment, and within a matter of just a few minutes, it was able to downregulate 903 different genes and upregulate 1,319 other genes, and start to turn the cell into a non-cancerous cell. So what that showed me was there's infinite amount of information that just one biomolecule in turmeric contains, because turmeric has 1,000 chemistries. It's an intelligent, orchestrated, complex food plant. So one of its compounds has all this information. That's an intelligence that no chemical we use to treat cancer has. And then also, it embodies truly a ability to alleviate suffering in higher multicellular species like a human or a rat. And that's really, to me, an embodiment of compassion. So when you look at the mythos, the lore associated with turmeric, going back to the Indian tradition, it's linked with a number of goddesses. It's the embodiment of one who shines a bright light, of compassion, and it has all these different names. So to me, it was just an illustration of how today we have the mythos, the old stories, all the plant wisdom that was once passed down orally. And then you have this almost alien-like entity of science that's coming in and it's scanning all the way down to a molecular level, all these different substances, trying to say, no, it's just about the chemistries. But even that approach has led us to the point we have to acknowledge that there's a miracle going on, that nothing even close to this type of medicinal action could be reproduced through a chemical. And so I think we're finding once again that the ancient approach to healing is really the one that we need to re-employ in this day and age.
Beautifully put. It feels like we are living in a time when it's easy to miss, to not perceive the intelligence that's around us, that is part and parcel and has created the natural world and us. There's such this mindset that wants to reduce humanity to a bunch of random molecular collisions.
Yes.
And we lose the fact that we are this brilliant creation.
Yes.
My body is a brilliant creation. And, it's easy to take the plants for granted. And here you've picked one plant and shown this impossible to recreate intelligence. Like, we can't, in a laboratory, create that kind of intelligence in turmeric. We can't create that in a prescription drug. As you described, maybe a prescription drug might have a couple of actions. I know every time a drug company finds that their medication actually has this other positive effect that they didn't even intend, they get all excited.
I know, right? It's usually a side effect. So you take something like Lunestra. It's a neurotoxic chemical that's been linked to increased mortality from all causes. So basically, it's a side effect that's probably almost killing you, knocking you out, and then they repackage it into the intended beneficial pharmacological action. It's just insane when you think about what they're doing. I wanted to point out that I agree with you that we're living in a day and age where really medicine has converted us all into objects of control, not intentionally necessarily, but the ultimate outcome is that it has nothing to do with healing whatsoever. It has to do with, if you have a planet full of billions of bodies, the best way to control, organize, exert, influence over those bodies is to control their definition of their self through medicine. It's actually rather disturbing, but I think that's true, is this is really a global political control system. It has nothing to do with healing any longer. So.
Well, it just reminds me that a healthy human has the launching pad to be an amazing creature. And I don't just mean somebody who can run faster and jump higher. A healthy human can fulfill one's potential, can fulfill one's personal, emotional, spiritual potential. A healthy human is unstoppable. And I think health in a lot of ways can really, it propels us to our genetic potential, our inborn spiritual potential, and that can be dangerous. I think, you look back in history, some of our greatest leaders and our most revered peacemakers, get shot and killed. So it's almost as if that the times are asking us to find that baseline of health, not just so I can be thin and sexy, that's nice, that's interesting, but it just feels like health is so much more. Health is empowerment.
Yeah, it goes pretty deep because, you think about, I like to think about sort of like the little miniature Big Bang that occurs in the womb through embryogenesis. You start off as just an egg and a sperm, and from that moment, a miracle occurs, which for some reason we forget soon after birth, maybe because of a colicky baby driving us crazy, that humans are an explosion from the void, from nothing into something. And there's no way we can explain this miracle through any present scientific notion. And so that's what happens on a daily basis. And again, that's the miracle of how we're exposed to absolutely devastating nutritional incompatibilities, toxic exposures all day long, stress unlike anything we've seen before, and we're still holding together, feeling quasi-healthy. It's because it's not that we depend on solely the biochemistry of our food, as you know, because this is what you do all the time through your amazing platform, the Psychology of Eating, is that we are a soul that has a body, not a body that has a soul. I mean, there is an element where the body has the soul, and it could be a prison if we're really not healthy. But as you have done such good work with, this isn't pseudoscience. It's not New Age. This is the truth. I even have some examples I've mentioned before in previous talks. The New England Journal of Medicine found when those who had received a cancer diagnosis were told either they had it or they didn't, regardless if it was actually a false positive or not, they had up to 26.9-fold increased risk of heart-related death within 1 week if they had been told they had a cancer. So you can imagine the power of belief is so strong that they literally died internally and physically because they gave up hope that they could live because they had cancer. And the other is true too. If a doctor comes in and says, guess what? The person could have a serious cancer. You're totally healed. It can completely induce within the body an elimination of that condition. There are documented examples of this. So the reality is that I think on the one hand, we are thinking we're these, molecules gnashing together, this, hunk of flesh, this carcass. And then on the other hand, we're starting to see the research itself, the science, proving that our belief, our choice is fundamental in determining our health outcomes.
And, there's the good news. Really, it's the good news is, on the one hand, I was thinking as you were speaking how you started getting very poetic. There's a place where if you really dive into science and you dive into the science of life and you really follow it, you have to become a poet almost, because we hit these places where science just reaches its limits in that moment and we can't explain the miracle. We can't explain the beauty. We can't explain this invisible big bang that happens in the womb that produces a life form out of really nothingness, out of this tiny amount of nothingness. We can't reproduce that in a laboratory. It's impossible.
No, it's such a beautiful thing. You could condense it down to this, which is that, science is truly the system where you have to see it to believe it. And then, traditionally religion or the finer arts and all that are about you have to believe it in order to see it. And actually, technically, my background is philosophy, and I focused on phenomenology, which is all about going to the things themselves. You have to open up your eyes, get rid of your assumptions, and try to really perceive what reality is. And in that case, there was something called the perceptual fade. So you didn't throw down assumptions on what you were seeing. You're just opening yourself to it. So it doesn't have to be religion, but the idea is that you're open and you think that possibility is there for healing, for all the things that we're so scared of maybe not being the only way of looking at it. I think that we're getting closer to acknowledging that the self-healing ability of the human body and soul is so profound that even though we're seeing the darkest times in history coalescing, even like the conspiracy theorists and Orwell and all these folks had predicted, we also are being forced to recognize that we are truly the primary agent in our experience, and that we can affect profound change just through some really basic choices and believing in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this question. In your work, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Well, in my work, what gives me hope really is the response that I see to those that are just looking for alternative information. Because, when I started, I was just a hobbyist. I just was compelled by the research. I wanted to share it because I was like, wow. So you start out writing a few articles, and before you know it, we went from just being a little database and a couple blogs to having several million visitors every month,
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really based on anything new. I still write maybe once every other day, and people out there are responsive because really this kind of information has been completely blacklisted, and so it's causing this kind of like ripple effect where Now people are going to your site, they're going to my site, they're making choices not based on just their doctor saying, you know, this is what the CDC says, you're going to do this or you're going to die. They're questioning things. They're saying, well, really? Well, here's research saying that's not true. So I think that ultimately it's really beautiful because the internet has given us a platform that anyone can use for free, speed of light, and really, you know, end up empowering themselves in a way that never was possible before. So I'm hopeful. I'm definitely hopeful.
Well, Sayerji, I so appreciate how you have really brought together so much information and really been faithful to the research and compiling it and just saying, okay, here's what science says. Here's some of the buried treasure that you might not know about. That's like kind of how I see you. It's like we sort of send you into the wilderness of information, and you come back with the nuggets that are really useful for us. So thank you. I would just love if you can share with us, you know, how we can stay in touch with you and your world and what we should know about.
Oh, thanks. Well, I love connecting through our newsletter, so I try to do that daily. You send out a daily newsletter. And then Facebook is, you know, okay, they recently censored our article on removing ovaries for preventing cancer. But regardless, that's still presently a way that a lot of our, you know, fans connect. So other than that, really, yeah, I encourage people to actually go through our site, pass through it, go to PubMed.gov themselves and give it a little try. It's the Global Brains Convolution dedicated to medicine. And it's just a miracle. You know, you go in, say you have diabetes and you want to learn about diabetes and ginger. Type in diabetes ginger, 70 studies. And it's just amazing when you look at the primary literature, which, by the way, almost no doctors do, you start realizing, wow, if this is true, then maybe I could start using natural medicine like, you know, their intuition is telling them. So it's good.
So beautiful, my friend. So that's greenmedinfo.com. Which is, you know, anytime somebody asks me what are my favorite online research resources for health, medicine, transformation, that's number one on my list. So thank you for the work that you do. Really appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you, Mark. I feel the same about your work.
All right. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in.